That's the thing about stories. They never really end, do they? We're still telling the same stories we've always told, just with different names, different faces.
The Fly is a 1957 science fiction horror story by French-British journalist and author George Langelaan. His name is French, so I might be pronouncing that wrong, but either way, he wrote the story The Fly. It's a short story. I don't own the individual book of The Fly, but I have it in this bigger book of short stories that were turned into movies. So I'll probably get more material out of this because they got stuff like Minority Report and other cool science fiction related stuff in here. The Fly is a fun little short story. It's pretty easy to read. It's only like 40 pages. I'm sure you can find the full text online somewhere. It's about the scientist working in his lab, and he discovers basically what we call teleporting. In the original book and the first movie adaptation, they called it, transmitting? How this teleporting and transmitting machine works, it's described in the book that it just basically disassembles all of the atoms in your body in point A and reassembles them all in point B. Well, sounds pretty easy. But the problem in the story comes from the fact that the scientist guy decided to test this device on himself one day. And just as the door was shutting on his machine, just a random little house fly buzzing around his laboratory goes in the machine with him. The fact that the fly was in the machine with him really messed up the process, and he just became this human fly monster cross hybrid thing. It's a classic 1950s science gone wrong sci-fi horror story that is very influential and has been adapted more than one time into other mediums. First of which was a film in 1958, the second of which was a film in 1986, and strangely enough, in 2008 there was an opera based on The Fly. This is another one of my adaptation showdowns. If you're new, if this is your first adaptation showdown, then welcome. I hope you enjoy this. What I do is I read the original source text of a novel, short story, novella, whatever you want to call them. I read the original text, and then I go watch every movie adaptation based off that original text, and I just go point by point using a totally non-quantifiable, non-scientific point system that I just kind of make up as I go, and I see which movie adaptation is most accurate to the original story. I am not saying what the best film is. I am not saying what my favorite film is. All I'm trying to accomplish with the Adaptation Showdown is just showing which movie adaptation is most accurate to the original story. So, all that said, let's begin. A good place to start with these Adaptation Showdowns is talking about some basic information about the story. So, in the original Fly story, it took place in the 1950s in France. So the 50s version of The Fly is only going to get 1 point for being set in the 1950s. The movie came out just like a year or two after the original story was published, set in current day when it came out. But the 50s Fly is not going to get a point for where it takes place because the book took place in France, and the movie, although there's a lot of French signs and everyone has a French sounding name in the movie, it actually takes place in Canada, in French Canada, Montreal. One of the opening shots from the 50s Fly, you see a sign on the outside of the family factory, their company, and it says Montreal there, so that is not France. 1980s Fly, well, it takes place in current day when it came out, so the 1980s, no point for that. And where does it take place? This story could be taking place in the US, could be taking place in Canada. I don't know. They don't really say. Although a cool little thing I noticed is that the 80s Fly movie was filmed in Canada because in one of the background shots, it's kind of quick, but I spotted the CN Tower, which is in Toronto. I actually went up in that one time. They have a glass floor and can stand over it and see 300 feet down or something. I don't know how tall it was, but tall enough to hurt if you fall. Next, let's talk about the character names. So, there's a handful of main characters in the original story, and they all got French-sounding names. Doesn't have to be exact, but which movie gets most of the names accurate like the original book? 50 Fly is going to get another point here. Basically, all of the names are unchanged from the original text. I think the only one in the book, the son character, his name was Henry or Henri because it's French, and in the movie it's like Philippe or something. The 80s Fly, I just thought all their names were kind of stupid. The main guy's name was Seth Brundle. Brundle sounds like some kind of evil witch in the forest thing. Gina Davis played, what's her name? Veronica Quaife? I don't know. How do you say that? The jerk character was named Stathis Borans. Who comes up with these? The original Fly story, I thought, had a bit of an unusual structure. We've got the Pre-Helene story, we've got Helene story, which is the bulk of the plot, and we've got Post-Helene story. So let's start with Pre-Helene story. In the original book, it starts with Francis Delam late one night at his house, and he gets a call from his sister-in-law saying she just squished his brother to death in the family factory. Which movie starts off like that? The 50s movie is going to get another point because we got Vincent Price wearing this. Wow, where do I get a suit jacket like that? Vincent Price gets a call from Helene saying, I just squished Andre. That's just like the book, they get a point. How does the 80s fly start? Well, it starts with a science convention or whatever's going on here where Gina Davis's character is this reporter who's writing stories about discoveries in the world of science, and she's talking to Seth Brundle, Jeff Goldblum here, just, being Jeff Goldblum, same character in every single movie he's in. They're not going to get a point. Not exactly like how the opening of the original book was. Next thing that happened in the original book is that after getting the call from sister-in-law Helene saying, I squished your brother, he goes to the family factory to investigate this, and he calls the cops, and the cops are going with them, and they all arrive at the factory. So which movie shows that as the following scene? The 50s Fly is going to get another point because we got a scene where Vincent Price and the cops and the medical people, they all go to the family factory, they unpress the hydraulic press and take his brother out. It's a pretty gruesome scene. The 80s Fly is not going to get a point because they don't have any kind of scene like that. Next, from the original Fly book, we have some important dialogue where the main guy, Francis, is telling the police investigator, Shiraz, that the controls for the hydraulic press that squished his brother are set in an unusual way. Something's off here. He doesn't know what's going on. And what movie's going to get a point for that? Once again, it's the 50s Fly.
It's never been set that way, never. But that would squeeze the metal to nothing. She didn't know how to operate the press.
80s Fly is not because they don't have any kind of scene like the factory unsquishing scene, like I mentioned, so no point for them. One thing I think is kind of cool is that a lot of the dialogue from the 50s Fly, especially this scene, was lifted more or less right from the book. Sometimes you could say it's unoriginal, but sometimes I think it's cool because basically what I'm watching in the movie is what was playing in my head as I was reading the book. So it's just kind of cool to see that played out live. Next point, in the original Fly story, there was another important dialogue scene where Inspector Shiraz is talking to Francis, and he reveals that he first suspected Francis as being the killer. What movie shows that? It's once again the 50s Fly.
You see, at first I suspected you.
Me? Why should I do such a thing?
Motive 1 for his wife, motive 2 to gain control of DeLorme Electronics.
Next, from the original Fly story, Francis and Inspector Shiraz decide that his sister-in-law Helene must be insane.
Mr. DeLorme, do you think she's mad?
It's obvious, isn't it?
And she is put away in, it's not like a real ratty hospital or anything. This is a real nice room. So I don't know if you would call this like a prison or whatever, but she's being held here for mental health reasons. She can't leave freely on her own will, so more or less a prison. I would go to this prison. Look at that. 80s Fly does not have a scene. No one is declared mad in the 80s Fly. Next, in the original Fly story, while Helene is being held in the hospital prison situation, the mystery deepens because the nurse who is attending to her sees a fly buzzing around the room. And like most people would, she gets a fly swatter or her hand or whatever she was using and swats the fly and kills it. And then seeing that, Helene goes crazy. She throws a fit. What movie shows that? Well, the 50s Fly shows that in all its blown out audio glory. Listen to that. No! 80s Fly is not going to get a point because it doesn't have any scene like that. Next important scene from the original Fly story is Francis is having dinner with his nephew. In the book, he's Henry, and in the movie, he's Philip or Philippe, whatever. Either way, Vincent Price's character is having dinner with his kid, and the kid asks,
do flies live a long time?
I don't know. Why?
Because I saw that fly Mommy was looking for again.
Oh, I didn't know your mother was looking for one.
Something's going on here. Why did Helene freak out about a fly in her hospital? Why is this kid asking about flies? What's going on? We'll find out. 80s Fly movie is not doing too hot right now. They have currently 0 points, but don't worry, they're going to get a few. So they're trailing, but they'll catch up in a minute. Next important scene from the original Fly book is that after having dinner with his nephew, he then goes to the hospital to visit Helene, and Francis piques Helene's interest because he tells her that the fly she was looking for earlier was in his study. That is just like in the original book.
The fly you were looking for was in my study today.
What he means by that is at the dinner scene where he was eating with his nephew earlier, the boy tells him that he was trying to catch a fly earlier, but it wasn't just any fly. It was a special looking fly. The fly had kind of a light colored white head to it. It separated it from all the other flies. It just looked different. I think Helene also mentioned something about a white-headed fly in the hospital. So Francis is starting to piece together that something's going on here. After Frances piques Helene's interest in the original story by telling her about the special white-headed fly, she then hands him a written manuscript. They call it, it's basically just a 20-page long confession that is the biggest chunk of the book. In the book, it's a written manuscript she hands him. That is the basis for the flashback. What movie shows that? Neither movie shows that. So the 50s Fly movie does have this big flashback section to the movie, but it's not done through a handwritten manuscript.
This is not a confession. Although I killed my husband, I'm not a murderess. I simply carried out his last wish. A few months ago...
Yeah, we're going for accuracy here. It's not a written thing. Whatever, no point. Next section is the big one. It's the real bulk of the story. This is where all the Fly stuff happens, the cool stuff about the story. This is a section where the 80s Fly is going to finally get some points. So in the original book, Helene's story starts with her husband, Frances's brother, the scientist guy, Andre, who eventually becomes a human-fly hybrid. He makes a great discovery about transmitting, teleporting, whatever you want to call it. Which movie adaptation starts with the scientist making a great discovery?
But there must be absolutely no mention of this made to anyone. You're the first to see a miracle.
I'm working on something that'll change the world and human life as we know it.
Next point, does the scientist guy demonstrate his super important invention to his significant other by teleporting some household object? In the original book, they said it was an ashtray. In this movie, they say it's an ashtray, and I'm not a smoker, but that doesn't look like an ashtray. They're usually little like bowl-shaped, and they have the little cutouts in it. So in the 80s Fly, Gina Davis's character gives him her piece of legwear there. She hands it to him, puts it in the teleporter, and boom, it's teleported. Next point from the original Fly story is that that initial object that he demonstrated his machine with, that household object, the ashtray that he transmitted, something was off about it. In the original book, on the bottom of the ashtray, it said "Made in Japan," and when it came out on the other end, that text was written backwards. The only movie to get a point for this is the 1950s Fly, because look at that. Made in Japan backwards. Or Napal ni Adam. Next point in the original Fly story is that a little after the initial household object test, the scientist Andre guy, he then tries to test with a living creature. Something goes wrong about the first test with the living creature. So the 50s Fly is going to get a point for that because he takes their nice, cute, white, fluffy cat and puts it through the transmitter, and it just, never comes out the other end. I'm also going to give a point to the 80s Fly adaptation because although it's not a household cat, he does do an animal test, and something does go wrong with that first animal test. Jeff Goldblum somehow acquired a baboon. That's never really made clear to me. He teleports the baboon, goes to the other end, and I don't know if I can show that on YouTube. It's pretty gory. You get an idea with the bloody handprint. Next point, from the original Fly story, after the initial living animal test failed, scientist Andre then works out the kinks in his machine, fixes some bugs, spends some time getting the whole thing to run smooth, and then he thinks it is finally running as best as it can. So he calls back Helene, shows her, hey look, the machine's working great, and she's really excited for him, and he says, let's celebrate by transmitting a bottle of champagne, and we'll drink it when it comes out the other end. So what movie gets a points for that? The 1950s movie is basically exactly like it happened in the original story. 1980s Fly movie, they do not transmit the bottle of champagne, but they do celebrate the machine's success with champagne, and I gotta be a little generous to the 80s Fly. For the next point, a little later, Andre does a test on another living animal, but this time it works. So what movies show that? The 1950s Fly movie is going to get a point because how it happens there is basically just like it happened in the original book. He takes the little guinea pig, transmits it, and it comes out fine the other end. In the book, the wife, Helene, named the guinea pig Haplo, which I don't know what that means. It's just a funny name, Haplo. 1980s Fly I'm also going to give a point because somehow Jeff Goldblum acquired another baboon, and he transmits it, and there's a moment of suspense, but look, he comes out, he's fine. He gives him a nice big baboon hug. Next point, in the original Fly story, scientist Andre tells his significant other that to really make sure that the second living animal test is successful, they have to wait a little bit to just make sure it doesn't, just drop dead 2 days later. So what movies show that? In the 1950s Fly, we're gonna get a point because more or less basically just like how it happened in the book.
I have to see if it suffers from any ill effects. If it's alive in, say, a month, then we'll pronounce the experiment successful.
1980s Fly is going to get a point because Jeff Goldblum recommends, waiting some time to make sure that baboon is just doing as good as a baboon can do.
Well, send the baboon out for tests, see if he's really okay.
How long will that take?
Could be weeks.
Next point from the original Fly story. This is the big one. The scientist decides to then test the machine on himself, and that test goes wrong. He becomes the Fly, the man-fly hybrid, half man, half fly, half pig. South Park joke. So what movies show that? 1950s Fly is going to get a point because, well, it's the Fly. It's the story. That's what the Fly story is. 1980s Fly is also going to get a point because, well, that's what the story is about. So both movies get a point. All right, moving on.
I caught such a funny-looking fly. You want to see it?
Now, you let it go at once. You know how your father disapproves of you catching insects.
It has a funny white head and sort of white legs.
So for the next point in the original book, after Andre tests the machine on himself and it goes horribly wrong, he leaves instructions outside his lab when Helene wants to go check on him the next day. And these instructions from the book say, something went wrong, but I'm okay for the moment. Just don't come in and look at me. By the way, bring me some milk with rum in it.
Knock 3 times to show you understand and agree, then fetch me a bowl of milk laced with rum. Bowl of milk?
I get the milk portion of this because, it's milk. It's got nutrients. He can slurp it up with his big fly nose. Why the rum? I don't know. There's sugar in rum, so maybe the fly likes sugar. Why not just say put sugar in the milk? Maybe he was just drinking because he's stressed, but then why not ask for rum separately? This is never explained to me. I wonder what milk and rum would taste like anyway. Maybe I'll try that after this. Reminds me of that scene in Men in Black where he's like, more sugar, put the sugar in the water. Next important point from the original story is that he leaves instructions outside his lab saying that Helene must try and find that weird, unique fly mentioned earlier with the white head.
Try to find a fly. You will easily recognize it. Its head is white.
It's critically important that he goes back through his transporting machine, not from A to B, but from point B to A, with that same weird fly that went through with him, so he can reverse the process. Maybe it'll work. I don't know. I mean, he never actually did it, so who knows? Maybe this would have just messed him up even further. Next point from the original book is that the horrific man-fly hybrid creature could not speak. He couldn't communicate to Helene verbally, so he used his typewriter and typed up notes and instructions for her. What movie shows that? The 50s Fly is going to get another point. 80s movie is not going to get a point because Jeff Goldblum's Fly was more or less always able to speak up until like the very last iteration when it was just this, I don't even know what that is. Next point from the original story is that Andre, as the man-fly horrific hybrid creature, wore a blanket over him when Helene came into his lab so she couldn't see him. Once again, it's the 1950s Fly that's going to get a point for this because there he is just sulking around with a blanket on his head. I know what he's doing, it just kind of looks funny to me. Just like got a towel on his head, just moping around. Next point from the original story is that the man-fly hybrid creature really started to undergo mental deterioration. His faculties were crumbling. He could barely think, and his ability to actually type up those notes and instructions to Helene was decreasing as the days went. So which movie more closely showed the mental deterioration of the man-fly creature? The 50s movie is going to get another point. The 80s Fly movie is also going to get a point because, although the 50s one did it more accurately to the original book, I don't think anyone who watches this would deny that Jeff Goldblum's character loses his mind. The first thing Helene sees of the man-fly hybrid creature is one of his hands. The 1950s Fly is going to get another point. Look at that. She sees the hand and she is not happy. For the next point, in the original book, Helene eventually convinces Andre that although she can't find that unique white-headed fly that he has to go back through the machines with, he should just go back through anyway, just to, maybe it'll work. What movie's going to get a point for this? Once again, it's the 1950s Fly. For the next point, there's an important scene in the original book where eventually that blanket towel thing that Andre was using to cover his hideous man-fly head with falls off, and Helene sees him in all his terrifying fly man glory. The 50s Fly is going to get a point. They show her in like fly vision there. I think that's kind of cool. 80s one is also going to get a point. So even though the 50s one did it more accurately, there is still a big scene towards the end where he goes full-on fly monster and Gina Davis sees him for the real monstrosity that he's become. Next important point from the original book is how is Andre the man-fly killed? In the original book, Andre is squished at the family factory by Helene with a hydraulic press. What movies show that? 1950s Fly, it's exactly how it was done in the book. 80s Fly, also is pretty cool and gruesome. Gina Davis just shoots him. That's not a hydraulic press. Before we declare who the winner is for the Adaptation Showdown, I just want to give out a couple more points for just, some little details I picked up on as I was going throughout the story. In the original book, the way Francois identified his squished brother at the factory to make sure it was indeed his brother was that on his left leg there was a big scar that he got in the war. So what movie shows that? It is the 50s Fly movie. Look at that scar. Next little detail point from the original Fly story is that Andre's devices for transmitting matter were described as modified phone booths. 50s Fly is going to get a point because although I don't see like a Bell Labs logo on that or something, that's basically a phone booth. 80s Fly, I'm also going to give him a point because although they don't look like phone booths, we do get a reference to phone booths.
Designer phone booths. Very cute.
I think it should be pretty obvious by now which version of the Fly won. It is the 1950s Fly. So let's give them their little celebration animation. I love the Fly head design. It's just, I don't know, it's kind of funny to me. It's like, just this, he looks like a sports mascot or something. Now that the actual Adaptation Showdown is done, let's talk about the movies. Which movie do I think is better, and which movie do I prefer? For both of those questions, I'm going to say the 1980s Fly. The 1950s Fly movie wasn't bad. It was good. I enjoyed it. There were some parts that were pretty cool, pretty creative. It wasn't the most exciting 50s sci-fi horror movie. There's a handful of other 50s science gone wrong kind of movies I can think of that just cooler. Most of the story was just Andre going back and forth around his lab with a blanket over him, being like, "Don't look at me." The 50s movie isn't bad at all. I just think that when you compare the two of them, the 80s Fly adaptation really took the horror and body horror aspects of this to the extreme. They really went hard with the idea that this is a man-fly hybrid monster that's messed up at the genetic level and just keeps evolving and mutating. It just went harder in every aspect. An important thing I want to talk about regarding the plot of the Fly story is the last section of it, which I didn't give out any points for, you may have noticed, which is the Post-Helene story section, which I mentioned way earlier in the video. In the original book, after her confession manuscript is done being read by Francois, and he tells us all to Inspector Shiras the next day, Helene was basically just deemed insane in the original book, and unfortunately she took a cyanide pill. It was a darker, more kind of grim ending. The way the 50s movie ends the story, I actually think improves on the original short story, and it's way more iconic than just two guys talking saying, "Oh, I squished the white fly." So the 50s Fly has this rather horrifying ending. Vincent Price's character is sitting on this bench, just, pondering all the fallout of the events of the past day that just happened. He hears this really small voice.
Help me! Help me! Please help me!
And he looks over, and it's the white-headed Fly, but it's spliced with the body of his brother Andre. Like how there was a human-sized Andre Fly hybrid, there was also a Fly-sized human Andre hybrid, and that is what Vincent Price hears calling for help while he's sitting on this bench. And we got a creepy little shot here of this guy going, help me," as a spider comes to eat him. But the spider doesn't eat him. Inspector Shiras just hits it with a rock. While the 1950s Fly story was very accurate to the original text, there were some things they took creative liberty on, some things they added. All of these things I do think added to the story. None of these were bad ideas, so let's just take a look at them. The opening scene is we get, what is he? He's like the night worker or night watchman of the family factory, or maybe he's like the first guy clocking in for the day. This guy is walking through the factory and he sees the immediate aftermath of Helene squishing Andre with the hydraulic press. She pauses for a second like deer in headlights and then runs off. This scene that we're looking at was only described in the original book, but here we actually get to see it, and I think it's more effective that way. The 1950s Fly adds a brief little scene where Andre and Helene go out to an opera for like a double date night with some friends of theirs, and the whole point of the scene is just to show that Andre is so obsessed with fixing his machine that his mind's not even there enjoying the moment with them. He's just scribbling scientific notes on the playbill of whatever they're seeing. In the book, this was only hinted at. It was glossed over in, small paragraph, a sentence or so. Here we actually get to see it. I think it's more effective this way. Another little thing they added in the 50s Fly movie was an additional test of an object that he transmitted, which was a newspaper. Just like the text on the ashtray that he transmitted, he picked up the newspaper and it was in reverse. There's also a few scenes that the 1980s Fly movie added. There's a little additional test he does with this piece of steak that he teleports and then cooks and feeds to Geena Davis. And she says she doesn't know a difference, so the machine must work, apparently. There's also a scene where Jeff Goldblum, as he's deteriorating, he just decides to get really aggressive and goes to this tough bar and just arm wrestle this guy until he breaks his arm in half. That wasn't in the original story. The 80s Fly also has this very cool, very creepy scene. This is such like a body horror David Cronenberg type of thing. It's this dream sequence, or nightmare sequence, I should say, where Geena Davis's character is dreaming that she is pregnant with the fly hybrid creature abomination, and she has to go to the doctor to get an abortion, and they pull it out, and oh my god, look at that thing. The whole monster fight scene at the end of the 80s Fly movie, that was not in the original book. They added that for the movie, totally original, and I think it's pretty cool. They also add a power that the Fly has that was not in the original book, which is that he has like acid spit or acid barf, whatever you want to call this, and he burns off Stathis's ankles, which is kind of disgusting. Oh yeah, and in the 80s Fly, I don't know why they didn't do this in the other movies, because this is actually, like if I were thinking of a Fly power, this seems obvious, besides flying, is that in the 80s Fly, you can like walk on walls and walk on the ceiling, like a fly would, I think it's pretty cool. The 80s Fly also has a completely different ending where Geena Davis just blows its head off. Next, before I wrap this up, I just want to quickly talk about some random fun thoughts I had while watching these movies. So, first off, for the 50s movie, there's this little scene where the dad says, "Go on, son, go play with the cat." And the son gives him this look. Look at this. What is that? What are you planning on doing with this cat, kid? I don't trust him. Also, speaking of this kid actor, I know he's a kid actor. He's not as experienced as Vincent Price and all these other people, but I can't stand his acting.
We'll all have dinner together later.
Oh, good.
Oh, good. Yeah, he's really excited for dinner. I'll give the 50s Fly movie some credit because, they didn't have computer effects. Everything had to be practical. There was a limitation on stuff back then, but I do think it's just kind of cool, the transmission process. You got all these neon tubes lighting up. You got all the scientific sound effects and whirring noises and the glowing stuff and the buttons. Just classic 50s laboratory stuff. I think it's pretty cool. One of the funniest things about the 1950s Fly movie to me is that after he does the failed test with the family cat, the cat never comes back out the other end and it's just lost somewhere in the ether. We get this little scene of Andre just hearing Dandelo the cat just meowing from the great beyond. I don't know why it's so funny to me. I like this little bit of dialogue from Helene in the 1950s Fly movie.
Oh, Andre, I get so scared sometimes. The suddenness of our age. Electronics, rockets, Earth satellites, supersonic flight. And now this.
Electronics, rockets, Earth satellites, supersonic flight, hula hoops, Coca-Cola, all this new technology, I can't handle it. Also from the 50s Fly movie, I can't decide, let me know what you think, of who Helene looks most like. Is it Wilma Flintstone, or Dexter's mom, or Judy Jetson? Or maybe it's just a cross between all three of them. I also think in the 50s Fly, this little typed note that Andre left for Helene just reads like a real moody teenager warning his parents before they come in the room.
Before you come in, you must promise to obey me implicitly. Do not look at me. Talking is useless. I cannot answer.
Do not look at me. Do not talk to me. Don't even speak to me. Stay away from me. To close out, one little random thought I had about the 80s Fly movie, and this is just a weird little thing that bothered me. It doesn't speak at all about the quality of this movie. They have like the same haircut. I don't know why this is bothering me. It's just like, how much fluffy 80s hair can I handle in one shot here? I've been talking for way too long and it is getting late, so I'm going to wrap this up. If you stayed till this point in the video, thank you very much. I appreciate it. As always, I hope you enjoyed this adaptation showdown of The Fly, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.